is I actually have no issues with the formulation of like the logical deduction of his argument, right? That's pretty airtight. There's no textual allusion, there is no typology, and there is no papacy. Like, just like straight up, this does not make any sense within the world of Jesus. There was no monolithic teaching authority in Second Temple Judaism among the Pharisees. So what's odd here is we actually have an internal gospel contradiction if we posit that.
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Ryan Warner. We're going to be talking about the Eliakim argument that is proposed by Swansona. It is essentially to prove Catholicism, to prove that Peter was the Pope, papal authority, all that kind of stuff. A lot of fun stuff. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I've been on Christmas vacation with my job. Just had my birthday. I got my beer here to celebrate tonight, so that's going to be on camera. I am Pentecostal, so I really shouldn't be drinking, but yeah, I'm excited to present this. I was made aware of Swan's argument a while ago, and I just said this to you, Zach, but I watched it 3 times, so at least a part of his argument 3 times. So I spent over 3 hours analyzing a phase of his argument, and I think I have some interesting alternatives. I've already been in conversation with Swan as well, and I'm doing this, so I'm excited for him to watch it and get his response.
Yeah, too. That sounds like an awesome opportunity. We'll see how this goes. Okay, so this Eliakim typological argument got popular essentially because Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity recently went public about becoming Catholic, and he claimed that the argument was so compelling that it led him to Catholicism. So, considering this is a typological argument, can you first define what typological means in this context, as well as given outside of this argument?
Yeah, so I believe that the literal word type appears in one of Paul's letters, where he says that, Adam was a type or Jesus was a type and things like that. Typology exists within Jewish literature. But typological arguments are like, hey, there's this guy, Peter, and he does all these things that are really, really similar to this other guy in the Old Testament, Eliakim. And so he's kind of like a type of that. He isn't that person exactly, but he's similar enough where we can say he's pulling these attributes or types, right? And he's imbuing them into Peter. And that in this context, so that like a type would say, hey, look at this past person or this other thing, you're like it. So we're going to take some of those realities from that type and employ them in you or in that other person or that other thing. And so what we see going on here is, in this specific argument, they're trying to establish that Peter is a type of Eliakim, who is, I believe, a treasurer in the under Hezekiah, one of the kings. And there are certain things said about Eliakim that they then take as types to sort of justify an interpretation for a magisterium, papal authority, and the papacy ultimately. And so that's what a typology is, and then the second question kind of is, what are they doing with it? That's kind of what they're doing with
it. There you go. Okay, so can you give us, you mentioned it. Oh, by the way, you're the first person to have beer on my channel, so I'm feeling like a little pagan right now, but I should be able to get through it. So... Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now? Anyways, can you give us a summary of Swan's argument as far as like, the evidence he uses to make the argument, and that'll essentially show like why it's so convincing to so many.
Yeah. I think we'll have to dive in here on Swan's argument in specifics. And before I do that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about myself and like introduce myself and my background. I am from Wisconsin, so that is why I'm drinking a beer. Got to fulfill our negative stereotypes, right, of a Wisconsinite. Um, but yeah, I actually would. Why I'm here today is I was a student at North Central University, which is a Assemblies of God Pentecostal school, full of great scholars, many of them from Fuller Theological Seminary, some of them from German schools. And then after I graduated, I went for pastoral studies, and then I actually, with a sort of biblical studies bent, I then got a scholarship to study in Israel for 30 days with Eli Shukron, Gabi Barke, who he's the guy that you probably heard from Resurrection Argument. He's the burial tomb guy. Eli Shukron excavated the city of David in the old city in Jerusalem. And Mark Turnage and Stephen Notley, who you probably have recently heard about the dig in El Araj, which they think they found the recent biblical Beit Saida. Those are the head archaeologists on that dig. And some of their books today, I actually have on my screen right now. These are all the books that I'm employing. I mean, I have one right here, Sage of Galilee. And you had asked me, like, hey, what book should I read? And so this is such a hard question, because basically what I'm going to be going through today, I'm going to go over Swan's argument, but I'm also going to be employing quite a bit of Jewish literature from the period. And what I mean by that is, like, 2nd century BC up to 2nd century AD is considered pretty acceptable to use for contemporary analysis of the New Testament. And like the Bible as It Was by James Kugel. So all of these books are super, super important to understanding how to read the Gospels. It's Jewish literature. Jesus talks and thinks like a Jew, and we have to get inside of his brain, his world, and on his turf to kind of understand what's going on here. And that's where that's the perspective I'm going to come from. And so, if someone were watching this, like, who is Ryan Warner? This is the kind of studies that I've done. I hope to get my master's in ancient Judaism, the origins of Christianity at some point. I have 2 kids and I'm married, so kind of hard to do that. And if you're kind of wondering, hey, Ryan, where can I learn more about this stuff? Mark Turnage, who is one of my personal friends and a legitimate scholar, he's studying under one of the original Dead Sea Scroll scholars who, were able to get access to them and translated them. He has something called the Biblical Nomad, where he posts extremely accessible articles on a lot of this kind of stuff. He also runs something called Windows in the Bible University. I just want to do a shout out for that. And then his Substack is free to read. It's called Biblical Nomad, so check that out. All right, so now I'm going to kind of answer your question here. What is Swan's argument? I do want to say, if you know Swan, he has a heart of gold. He is one of the kindest people I've met. The way he carries himself online is amazing. His channel is really good. So if you want to give him a subscribe, even if you're not Catholic, right, just to be exposed to other ideas, I think that's healthy. I think it's okay to learn about this stuff. I would totally check that out. You can even see his featured video is literally the new Eliakim typological argument for the Papacy, which is, I think he streamed that about 5 months ago. What is his argument? So let's take a look at it. He actually lays his argument out in 3 parts, which I really appreciate. He claims that, or he doesn't claim, he says that Joe Schmidt helped him formulate it, which I think is apparent in how clear it is, and I really appreciate that. There's a lot of clarity in argument, and I think that adds a lot of force to what he's saying. But why I think this is important to know about the 3 parts is I actually have no issues with the formulation of, like, the logical deduction of his argument, right? That's pretty airtight. The problem is some of the premises he tries to establish are faulty, in my opinion. So what's important is to understand the dependence and phases of his argument. And each phase of the argument is absolutely necessary to kind of get you to the next one. So if you can take apart one of the phases, you sort of dismantle the entire, house. It all falls apart. And so if one portion falls, the entire framework crumbles. So here is actually a screenshot from his presentation. He has 3 phases. Phase 1 is establishing a textual allusion.
So I just want to talk about what are the specific phrases and what's the verse in Isaiah, like what's going on specifically there, and then Matthew 16.
All right, so Peter's confession of Christ. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And this is where we kind of get into the meat of this. Simon Peter answered, you, meaning Jesus, are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. And then he warned the disciples that they should not tell no one, and that he was the Christ. So essentially, Matthew 17 through 20 is kind of where the most of this. Matthew 16 through 20 is where this verse is hypothesized to be alluding to Isaiah 22:22. And so what does Isaiah 22:22 say? Right. So it says, I will hand your authority over to him, and he'll become a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And then I will put a key of the house of David on his shoulder. And when he opens, no one will shut. And when he shuts, no one will open. I will drive him like a firm peg in a firm place, and he'll become a throne of glory to his father's house. So essentially, they're trying to posit the keys, the shutting and opening versus binding and loosing, and the firm peg being a rock. And so those are similar, and there's the 7-step method here is going to cross over into all of them. Phase 2 is establishing, there's an allusion here, so what's going on with the allusion? Is there typology happening? And then phase 3 is then taking the typology and running to the papacy. So what I'm going to be focusing on is phase 1. I'm not really going to be touching anything else because I don't care. There's no textual allusion, there is no typology, and there is no papacy. And honestly, I'm not super well learned on the phase 3 of the argument. I just didn't even go there because my expertise is going to be more on the biblical studies type of things. And phase 1 is arguably going to be the most contentious in New Testament scholarship. And phase 2 and 3 are much more philosophically grounded, right? They're not as hermeneutically grounded because phase 1 is sort of justifying the hermeneutical stuff. And then once he does that, he kind of grants it for the rest of the argument because he doesn't have to worry about it. But if you can make him worry about it, then the rest of the argument sort of crumbles. So my personal expertise lies more with New Testament studies. So that's kind of what his argument is. From a high level, and then the rest of this presentation is going to be sort of delving into phase 1. What's going on with phase 1? What is the textual allusion how does he try to employ that textual allusion? And how is he trying to get there? What are the problems with it? And he has a 7-step methodology for establishing the allusion, and I'm going to systematically go through each 7-step and tell you if they're good or bad and why it doesn't work.
So, as you know, Dr. Rucker, in his dissertation, he talked about how the, dominant view in scholarship is that there is an allusion. And so what you're saying with all this, and it seems like you've really put your time in to do this argument. What you're saying is you're going against all this scholarship. Doesn't that make you a little hesitant in your approach here?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, I'm not the only person who thinks this, and there's other scholars who think this that I personally reached out to kind of gather evidence for this presentation or get their ideas or to make sure I'm not wrong. And they're like, no, there's no illusion here. And these are scholars who are at the top, they have PhDs from the top universities overseas. Fun fact, PhDs overseas are better and more valuable. If you're trying to get hired at a university in the US and you get a PhD from a European, like a London Theological Seminary or a place in Israel, that is seen as better than an American one. Pro tip, if anyone's wanted to do that. But these are scholars that have studied under the top, this David Flusser right here is the preeminent scholar on Second Temple Judaism, ancient Judaism, and the origins of Christianity. And the professors I'm talking to were his students. So these are all top scholars on ancient Judaism, Jewish interpretation, experts on the Gospels and Jewish interpretive methods. And they're like, no, there's no allusion here. They disagree. This is not what's going on here at all. And they're positing their own ideas into the text.
Wow, yeah, that's a really big claim. Okay. Your main issue is phase 1. So can you talk about phase 1 specifically? What is he trying to argue in phase 1?
Yeah. So how does he try and argue phase 1, right? So he endeavors to posit a typology via a 7-part method used by Dr. Richard Hayes. What I intend to do is actually utilize this method along with Swan in a side-by-side analysis. And at the end of phase one, Swan suggests that we must do one of the following in order to dismantle his argument. He actually says this in the video. So this is what he's doing. He says, hey, these are the 7 criteria that Richard Hayes and other New Testament scholars really kind of say, hey, this guy's great. Let's use his 7-step criteria. This is going to help us establish an allusion. And what's interesting is this 7-step criteria is used specifically for Pauline literature, not for gospel literature. And I'm not really going to go there because Paul and Jesus do exist on different spectrums within ancient Judaism in terms of how they think and operate. And that's okay. But I'm just going to kind of grant this because that gets super complicated and I don't really want to get into that for the video. Like, okay, what type of Jew was Jesus? How did he think? What kind of paradigm did he employ? What stream of thought did he belong to? And how does Paul differ? And why can't we use this? But I'm not really going to go there. I'm just going to kind of grant this for the sake of it. But what Swan says is we have to do one of 2 things. We have to provide a standard for textual allusions that's different than Hayes, so that we can say, hey, we don't use this, use a different one. I feel like it's a high bar, right? He's setting a super high bar. That would take someone years to do. 2, or not years, maybe months, but 2, or that it does not meet Richard Hayes' standards or disagree with his standards. I'm not going to disagree with his standards. I'm going to grant that. I'm actually going to use the own method to then show why this doesn't work. And I'm actually going to I'm basically going to do what he said here. It's not going to meet the standard of Richard Hayes. And so I'm just going to jump right into the 7-step method here. So there's going to be, most of the slides here are going to be dedicated to the 7 steps in here. So the first one is availability. And this first step here is to essentially say, oh, you know what? I think I jumped ahead here. So Swan points out that scholars have a few tools in their hermeneutical tool belt to help them determine if there's an allusion going on here. Swan shares that there is an obligatory intertextuality via the textual allusion principles given by Hayes. So let's move on. All right, so availability. Did Jesus just even have access to Isaiah? Would he have known and existed? Did Jesus have access to the hypothesized document he would be alluding to? The answer is yes, right? This isn't really saying very much, though. This is essentially saying it wasn't impossible for Jesus to have made an allusion, right? Like, for example, if I'm from the Revolutionary War and I cite, something from The Lord of the Rings, like clearly, or someone's trying to posit that I'm alluding to The Lord of the Rings. Well, The Lord of the Rings came way, 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 way after, hundreds of years after. It would have been impossible for me to have alluded to a book that didn't exist yet. And so that's what this premise is trying to do, is try to prevent sort of like a logical impossibility. Obviously, this is extremely important to the argument because, hey, I prevented an impossibility claim against me, but it doesn't really say much. It actually doesn't do very much. And I'm actually going to grant this one to him because it doesn't really do anything. All right, so the question is, did Jesus have access to Isaiah 22:22? He does. We know for sure that Isaiah goes back to the 2nd century BC, or maybe even earlier. We have early documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus would have had access to it. I think even one of the Gospels, he opens the scroll, right? He opens the Torah scroll, so he had access to that as well, and Jesus could read. That's what that verse is signifying. So he definitely had access to this. And so, Swan is going to be able to meet this criteria with flying colors. Swan posits that Jesus spoke in Aramaic. It's kind of a small detail, but I don't think, this is not something that I hold to, which is kind of a side note. I think there's compelling evidence that Jesus did speak Hebrew as the main language within the Galilee and in the Judean Hill Country. But even that doesn't really matter. And I think that's where I kind of mentioned before, some of these criteria, like you pass them with flying colors, but just because you have access to a document doesn't necessarily mean that you alluded to the document. But you have to kind of establish that first before you can move forward. The next criteria is going to be volume. And, on the flip side of things, not all criteria in this 7-part list are going to be equal in weight. And I think this is by far one of the most weighty and important criteria that Swan is attempting to establish. And I think this is the biggest part where the method is actually working against Swan. here. And so the question is, what is Swan saying? Essentially, there are three parts to the volume. I don't really like the name of this part of the criteria, but Swan shares that there's three parts. There's repetition, so there's a verbatim or repetition of words in syntactical patterns, and the rhetoric is similar or has an echo as subtly and follows the same rhetorical stress placed on the phrase. So these sentences are not necessarily worded in the clearest way, but essentially verbatim would be citing a verse, right? Citing part of a verse. Paul does this or Jesus does this, where even in sayings, they will like invoke part of a verse or have similar syntactical patterns. And so here's a couple of examples from Swan's presentation, because I don't want to straw man him at all. So here's an example of Romans 8:33-34. Who will bring charges against God as elect? God is the one who justifies. Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is he who died, but rather it was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. And there's Isaiah 58, chapter 50, verse 8. Because he who justified me draws near, who is the one who contends with me? Let him confront me at once. Yes, who is the one who contends with me? Let him draw near. So notice how there's a correspondence in similar verbatim between the verses here. It's very clear that Paul is invoking Isaiah 50, chapter 50, verse 8 in this short portion of text because it has a similar phrase going on, even though whether Paul used the Masoretic or the LXX, but you can see clearly there's like a parallelism going on here. So this is what's interesting. Swan goes on to say that Hayes intends that both be present in order to establish an allusion or to kind of establish this criteria, which is, in my opinion, the most important one. Verbatim and repetition of words and syntactical patterns. Swan is fully ready to admit that there is very poor verbatim repetition here. He says this in the video. He says the syntactical correspondence without verbatim of words between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19 is enough to justify the allusion or to match this criteria. Because, and this is in his own words, there are almost zero, or there are no words that are repetitive besides the word and. So he's kind of self-admitting here this is pretty weak. He goes on to share that some scholars are okay with just syntactical correspondence alone to establish an allusion. And so what he does here is he takes both of the verses here and he kind of like smashes them together in like this boiled down version. So he says God versus Jesus, first person, will give keys. So key of the house of David versus keys of the kingdom of heaven. To a man, Eliakim versus Peter, whose authority is exercised, no one shall versus in heaven, in contrast of open shut versus bind loose. And I think this is really dangerous. When you do this kind of stuff with the Bible and you're like boiling verses down, I think you completely destroy what's going on. And I think this really opens the door for certain types of eisegesis to happen. But I think what's going on here, and this is the issue that I'm going to posit, the house of David and the kingdom of heaven they're not close enough alike. And we're going to go into that a little bit. And binding and loosing and opening and shutting they're so different ideas. And I understand why Swan thinks that they're similar, but the world that they're coming from, they're completely divorced from each other. And that's because when you look at it from a Second Temple Jewish perspective, things will get a little bit more clear. So before we do that, we're going to keep going here. So Swan shares that Hayes intends that both repetition and syntactical patterns need to be present. Swan posits that there is syntactical correspondence without verbatim. And I think this is where Swan gets into trouble a little bit. So what's weird is he's like, hey, I'm going to use this method to establish an allusion. He gets into it, and then the second one, he's already realizing, oh, well, the method doesn't actually work, so we're going to alter the method a bit. I think Swan would probably admit that is a little odd that he's doing that. And then Swan removes all language and boils down all of these different nouns and verbs into different definitives and contrastives. And ultimately, the issue here lies with how he is saying the kingdom of heaven and binding and loosing are similar to the house of David versus open and shutting.
Ryan, so just to be clear for everyone here, what exactly, I mean, you're saying that that he is almost changing the roles a little bit. Like, what is he specifically saying that's different than what he said previously? I guess.
Yeah, so the red there, that's the red in my slide is where I kind of pointed it out. Swan admits that there is no verbatim of repetition of words in these two verses. They don't sound alike in terms of the wording. They're very different. And what's interesting is that Hayes, who created this method he's using, actually says that you need to have verbatim of repetition of words and similar sounding patterns, right? So he's saying there's a pattern here. Um, and Swan goes on to say, well, we're not going to do that. So he's trying to use this method, but the method is kind of blocking him in some way. So he cuts part of it out and kind of changes the method to his needs a little bit.
Okay, so that seems a bit odd because I'm just like, we'll kind of talk about this later, but we have other passages in the Bible where we don't have the specific verbatim repetition of words. So why would Hayes say this to begin with when it seems like we have other like references like in Revelation, and even Jesus does this, I believe, where he's referencing prior things that happen without like verbatim word uses.
Yeah, I think that if you're trying to posit an illusion, especially when it's, to be honest, when I get into this even more, it's going to get pretty convoluted. Like the way, even like me trying to recite Swan's argument, I mean, him trying to establish this took over an hour in his video. I think it's pretty complicated and convoluted. I think there's a lot more clarity that can be said here. So, can can there be an allusion to a verse with syntactical patterns? I think so, but I think when you remove that verbatim, you're sort of removing a lot of credence to positing an allusion. And that doesn't mean that there is no allusion there, but I think what I'm going to do in a bit here is I'm actually going to posit an alternative reading that is contemporary and more likely to be true than an allusion. And that would rule out an illusion, actually. And I think that's where this sort of becomes really improbable. Because you know what, I can't like prove that it's impossible, right? That there's no illusion here. I think we could have hypothetical illusions all over the Bible that are just not true. And I think this is one where I can see why someone might think there's an illusion, but when you get closer to the context in the world of Jesus and understand the different words he's saying in Matthew 16:19, it gets more and more unlikely.
So what you're
Does that
saying,
make sense?
yeah. So what you're saying is Hayes. When you're saying that Hayes thinks there has to be verbatim repetition of words and syntactical patterns, that's like not completely necessary, but it's just one of the points that makes for strong evidence. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you think Hayes is doing?
Um, Swan, so I haven't read Hayes, but Swan in the slide here, I'll take him at his word. He says that Hayes intends that you need both of those to sort of get a A+ on this part of the criteria.
Huh. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean
that answers my question.
that's how, and then he kind of goes on to say, well, he's not going to agree with that. He's going to alter the method for his own uses, um, and which is fine. I mean, I don't necessarily think that. I just think it is a little weird that you picked a method and then as you start to use the method, it's not working and you're shifting it. That sort of does undercut the trust or credence I'd have in an illusion here.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, you can keep going.
All right. All right, so we're going to go into. So Swan knows this, right? So he actually has 4 slides that tries to rectify what's going on here. He tries to explain the syntactical correspondence and why that's enough. Because Swan knows. He knows that he doesn't have the verbatim, repetition of words. But he does deviate from the method because it's not fully working. So he shares that given sufficient reason, we can deviate from this method. And you know what? If he wants to do that, that's fair. Let's continue granting that and move forward. So as mentioned, he goes on to share that even just syntactical correspondence is sufficient in the eyes of some scholars. He doesn't cite them, I don't think. So I think we can move on here. But what's odd here, I already mentioned I mentioned to this. Oh, no. Never mind. I didn't mention this. So what is odd here is that Swan argues for availability in part one, right? Did Jesus have access to this document to cite it or allude to it, or could he have read it? But then why would so he part of the criteria is, did Jesus have access to the verse? And there's some sort of internal incongruence here. So Jesus, one, he had access, but then two, he doesn't actually have any verbatim citation going on here. Why deviate so much, Jesus? That doesn't make sense. I think that this is, and again, this is I'm kind of planting seeds as to why, hey, maybe there's an alternative reading of this that's more likely. But I think that's odd that literally right before this, you have to posit that Jesus had access to the document, but then trying to posit an allusion, and there's there's a huge dissimilarity in the language going on here. And then he's trying to go back into the syntactical correspondence. So again, just trying to say that that is a little odd. That does make me feel less trustworthy of this criteria. But there are 4 slides here at the bottom, and these are all going to get bigger as we move on. They're going to kind of like, I'm going to zoom in on one and shrink down one. But the 4 are, he posits that Jesus modifies scripture. So because Jesus modifies scripture, he's actually taking Isaiah 20:22 and just like changing it to fit his bill, to fit his prerogative, and then that would explain why the language is so different. The next would be reasonable explanation as to why open and shut versus bind and loose. Another reasonable explanation would be no one in heaven, no one shall versus in heaven. And the last one is why the house of David and the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to focus on, if you notice, I gave him a check mark on the Jesus modifies scripture. Like, that's fine. I'm not going to go into that. What I think is a little interesting is open and shut versus bind and loose. So Swan shares that Jesus would have used common language to establish some sort of authority. So binding and loosing has to do with halakhic authority. And halakhic authority within, I have a couple of slides that are going to go into this in a little bit, but it's essentially legal lore. Jews from this period were steeped in debate around the Torah and how to be a good observant Jew, especially among the Pharisees. The Pharisees debated ritual purity, and we find Jesus debating ritual purity with the Pharisees quite often in the Gospels. And so this would have been common language for Jesus to use. And so what Swan is saying here is that the reason why Jesus didn't actually cite the verse he was citing, he just changed it because it wasn't a natural option to refer to teaching authority at the time. I think that he would be correct in saying that Jesus is referring to teaching authority. But I think once you understand what's going on with this verse, it starts to become a little bit of a non sequitur, where the conclusion doesn't follow. Because halakhic authority is a very specific thing to endow. It has nothing to do with the Old Testament verses, has nothing to do with much of the Old Testament. In fact, it's actually quite confusing that Jesus would use common language for ritual, for that different Jewish sages, which were, Jesus was like a Jewish sage. Like this book right here is called The Sage of Galilee. Jesus would have been a traveling Jewish sage who taught Torah and taught what does it mean to obey God? How do we actually fulfill the Torah? And how do we actually, fully obey God? And different Jews had different ways to interpret Torah. And at the time, we begin to see 2 houses kind of get created within the Pharisaic realm of thought. One of those is the house of Shammai, and the other is the house of Hillel. So what Jesus is doing here is he's telling his disciples that they have authority to take halakhic teachings, his teachings, and apply them to the movement of the movement of Jesus. And this would have been very common. Many sages would decide to bind and loose various things for their movements and disciples based on their view of the oral Torah. And this is exactly what's going on here. Jesus is saying, hey, you have the authority to take my words and apply them to different binding and loosing. And this would have take his midrash, which would be like his interpretation of Torah, and create rules based off of this. We actually see this in the literature here. So Dandy's Mishnah, the 3rd division, which has to do with some of the, it's very boring to read, the Nashim. There's two houses here, Shammai and Hillel. So 4 kinds of vows the sages have declared not to be binding. Vows of incitement, vows of exaggeration, vows made in error, and vows that cannot be fulfilled by constraint. The school of Shammai says, for them, the vow is not binding, but for the others with them, it is binding. And the school of Hillel says the vow is binding for neither of them. So this is an example of what halakhic authority is. You basically can say, based off of these teachings or this stream of thought, certain things are not allowed. And we actually see this happening right in the New Testament, which we're going to get to in a second. But I wanted to posit another citation from the first century here, which is Flavius Josephus, who harkens back, I think, to the Hasmoneans. Now Alexandra hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree as being herself a woman of great piety towards God, but these, notice, the Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor by little and little and became themselves the real administrators of the public affairs. So essentially they became popular with the people. They started kind of ruling they were the ruling crowd of the ruling party. They banished and reduced, so banished is bind and reduced would be loose. Banished and reduced whom they pleased. They bound and loosed men at their pleasure, and to say all at once they had the enjoyment of the royal authority, whilst the expenses and difficulties belonged to Queen Alexandra. So we kind of see again what is going on here, having authority to essentially create rules for different groups of people. We actually see this authority that was given by Jesus to the apostles to take his teachings and apply them to his movement right in Acts 15:19. Therefore, it is James, his judgment, that we do not cause trouble for those from the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them that they abstain from things contaminated by idols, from acts of sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations, Moses has those who preach him in every city, since he is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So essentially what he's doing here is he is saying, you have the authority to take my teachings and create binding and loosing off of that. So what's odd is, if Jesus wanted to allude to this verse, he's doing it in the worst way possible. I know that, he's trying to posit that this would have been a common way to establish authority, but not the type of authority that exists in Isaiah. It's a very specific authority used by Jewish movements among the Pharisees. So an alternative explanation is Jesus isn't positing an allusion here. He's using contemporary examples it's a simple explanation to say that we have access to us, a contemporary example as to why Jesus would have said this specific phrase versus over something like a more convoluted and hermeneutically entangled allusion. So notice how this is actually much simpler to say. This is actually a common thing that Jesus would have done. Whereas to then go on and say that this is connected to a verse, that's an additional jump. Is it impossible? No. But now we're getting to the point where things are getting really improbable. So Jesus was using a common Jewish, Pharisaical terminology here. And that actually is somehow connected to binding or to opening, shutting. And so I know it sounds a little convoluted here in trying to explain. I'm saying like halakha and all these different things. It's a jump to then take this and then to connect it to Isaiah. And I think that what we have here is enough to make sense of the text. We don't need to then posit an allusion. So the binding and loosing becomes problematic.
If you are saying that, all these references are kind of the ideas that Jesus was thinking about when he was saying these specific, binding and loosing and the other things we talked about, what reason would we think that Jesus would even be familiar with that? I mean, some of the texts you mentioned are not in Jesus' time period. It's actually a little bit later, or even sometimes much more later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. This is, I don't know a single scholar who doesn't, I don't think any scholar would disagree with this, but things in the Mishnah, especially about Shammai and Hillel were from the generation before Jesus. And let me try to pull up actually some information here. Let's see, rearranging my slides. Jesus would have been aware of this language because Jesus belonged to the Pharisaic movement of he aligned himself with Hillel more than anybody, and Hillel tended to be more humanistic in his not in like an atheistic sense, but he tended to value human life and human preservation and human flourishing over strict Torah observance, where Shammai was extremely strict. He was like Shammai was like, don't even talk to Gentiles. Hillel would be like, oh, if you're a Gentile, you can be my disciple. And they were both Pharisees, but they were on different ends of a spectrum. And we know that Jesus was most likely a Pharisee because of what he wears. He wears tassels known as tzitzit, which that was traditional Pharisee garb. That is in Matthew 9 that we find that the woman touches the fringes of his robe, but that is actually translated as tzitzit. The use of parables in the Gospels. Only this is something that is most people don't know this, but it's 100% true. Only Pharisees spoke in parables. Sadducees did not. The Essenes did not. Only Pharisees did. So Jesus was a Pharisee by definition. Jesus continually holds debate around ritual purity, which would be associated with halakha or halakhic teaching, with his contemporary Pharisees. This is a topic that Pharisees spent more time on debating than other Jewish sects. We even get this idea from the Essenes, who crafted a derogatory term for the Pharisees. They're called the seekers of smooth things instead of seekers of the way of Torah, which is what Pharisee means. Or that's what they called themselves, not what Pharisee means. Pharisee is actually a derogatory term. Like, if you were a Pharisee, you wouldn't call yourself a Pharisee in the first century because it was like a derogatory term. The Pharisees often practiced extreme ritual purity, and some who were more strict would mimic the high priest ritual purity. Jesus didn't, though, so Jesus differs. Jesus did practice ritual purity, but he was much more willing to eat with people who are unclean. Like when it says he ate with sinners or tax collectors, those were unclean people he ate with because he said it's not on the outside that defiles you, it's on what's on the inside that defiles you. So, and also it's very odd that we find Jesus more than any other group. He continually travels and debates with Pharisees who possibly held different views than him. In a Western context, debate is seen as antagonistic, but in the world of Jesus, debate was welcome and expected. The reason we find Jesus debating with Pharisees is most likely due to them being his friends or contemporaries. And the fact that we find Jesus traveling with Pharisees is another indicator of this notion. Why would he be traveling with opponents? Weird. Doesn't work out to be that sound. The best explanation is that Jesus surrounded himself with contemporaries. So Jesus would have been very familiar with binding and loosing. The kingdom of heaven terminology was also a Pharisaic terminology that developed among the Pharisaic Jewish sages that traveled around Galilee and taught. Sounds like Jesus. So Jesus belonged to those movements. He decided to align himself with those movements, and that would have that would have made that language accessible and available to him, and it would have been common for him to know this stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy to think about. A lot of that I didn't know about. Yeah, so I just talked to Rucker literally a couple hours ago, and Dr. Rucker, Timothy Rucker, and I asked him why he thinks that, because, okay, so first of all, he does think there's an allusion from Matthew 16 to Isaiah 22. And I asked him, okay, so if we only have this one possible word in common here, which is key, then why do we have, why does it seem like Jesus is changing the phrase of no one can, what he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open, to Matthew, which is whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So why does he change that phrase? And his explanation for that was, if you look at verse 8 to 12 in Matthew 16, it's talking to the Pharisees, and he's basically saying, hey, like, those are the people of the day that, educating, teaching people. And then he's taking that and saying, hey, don't be like them, be like the teaching, or you can teach instead, basically. Almost like, he literally says, then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So he's basically saying, don't listen to the Pharisees and Sadducees, you can teach instead. So, I mean, does that contradict or go well with your view? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to pull this one up. Thematic coherence. I'm going to jump ahead. It's actually the next section. So Rucker suggests that Jesus is transferring the authority from the Pharisees and Sadducees to Peter. When I read this is actually right from Swan's presentation. It correlates to what you're saying. This does not make any sense. Just like straight up, this does not make any sense within the world of Jesus. There was no monolithic teaching authority in Second Temple Judaism among the Pharisees, and Pharisaic debate and criticism was welcome and expected. And I mean this with all respect, but this idea from Rucker, and I have it written here, is literally pure fantasy. That does not make any sense. And what's even odd is in Matthew 24, Jesus endorses the Pharisees as a fellow Pharisee. Jesus himself is a Hasidic Pharisee that is more aligned with the house of Hillel, and that would be a whole different discussion. But Jesus actually says, actually listen to them, right? Listen to what they teach, but don't actually do what they do. So what's odd here is we actually have an internal gospel contradiction if we posit that. Matthew 24 endorses the sect of the Pharisees in Matthew in this chapter. And it's been, it befuddles quite a few of scholars because Matthew actually has some of the most anti-Jewish language in it in all the Gospels. Like when it says like your blood among my children, there's some really weird stuff in Matthew that we don't find in other Gospels, but that's a whole different issue. But what's odd is we actually have Jesus endorsing the movement of the Pharisees. So why would he be transferring the authority in 16, but then endorsing them in 24? All right, so the last slide here on the binding and loosing. So why, again, this is kind of like a rhetorical question. Why would Jesus, a traveling Pharisaic Jewish sage, utilize common terminology within his movement to establish halakhic teaching authority to actually establish a magisterium? Very weird, getting really improbable. This is, I think this is where I think this betrays the Jesus of history. So, and there's actually another part of Swan's view where he talks about like Jewish history of interpretation. And I think what's going on here is like, this is not a very Jewish way to read Jesus. This is not how a Jew would have thought. They would not have done something like this that is so roundabout. It just doesn't happen, right? Like you mentioned, sometimes they don't use verbatim words, but this is very weird that Jesus would be using something common and then actually be alluding to a verse. Contemporary first century Jewish people, like when Peter heard this, it is improbable that Peter would have thought he's alluding to Isaiah. It's improbable that any of the Jewish readers of the New Testament would have thought he's alluding to Isaiah 22:22. It just doesn't make sense when you put yourself in the boots of a Jew in the first century. It just doesn't work. Why would Jesus use something like halakhic authority, which is not at all like opening and shutting? I mean, I know that in English it sounds that way or feels that way, but culturally it's not at all the same. It's like different worlds. And so I think that's why this gets really improbable, and I don't think Jesus would have done this.
Okay, just for clarity, can you remind us what halakhic authority is?
Yes. So what is halakha and Haggadah? So Haggadah is essentially storytelling with a message. And both of these teaching styles are they're like paralleled a lot. So that's why I'm talking about Haggadah a little bit. So Haggadah is like a parable that Jesus would have used. It's a common storytelling message that would have spoke to the educated elite as well as the commoner of the time. It's a story that calls you to action. Think of like the parable of the prodigal son, or probably that's actually the wrong title for that parable, the parable of the two lost sons, because both the sons are lost. These stories connect the story of God, views of Torah, with emotional storytelling to instill the ways of God among people. So Haggadah was way more popular with the commoner, right? Kind of like today, right? You go to church, and a lot of churches can be more story driven. Usually a sermon has a story appended to it that motivates people to action. Maybe it's a story from the Bible, maybe it's a testimony. Where Haggadah or Haggadic teaching would be much more like technical Torah lore, kind of what we're doing right now. Like, on a Sunday morning, this wouldn't go too well with the Sunday audience. So Haggadic teaching would be teaching in parables, which we find Jesus doing quite a bit, but Jesus also would have participated in halakhic teaching. So halakha was the legal lore. It was the way of life a Jew should live according to a specific interpretation of Torah. There was tension between these two ways of relating God to the Torah, as Haggadah was more imprecise, right? Like parables are very hard to like quantify, and there's lots of debate on like parable interpretation. But halakha is very much like, don't do this, but do that. But don't do this, but do that. It's much more precise in like, how do we follow God? How do we connect with God? And things like that. So that's what halakha would have been. And I kind of showed an example of it in Acts, and then another example from Danby's Mishnah.
Cool. Okay, so just so we're on the same page, so what you're saying is that it doesn't make sense for Jesus to use the normal phrase and terminology of halakha teaching to refer to Isaiah, which is not about that.
Exactly. It would be very weird for a Jew to do this. It would be like weird. Within the world of Second Temple Judaism, a Jew would not have done this. Like maybe he still did. Maybe he just did something weird, but it becomes more improbable. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to show that this is like completely impossible. What I'm trying to show is like this is not a very probable interpretation of this passage. And as we keep moving, there's issues with the kingdom of heaven and David as well, which we can move on to.
All right, let's go for it.
All right, so the kingdom of heaven. So Swan goes on to say here that there's overlap between these two phrases. So he goes into 2 Samuel, your house and your kingdom shall endure forever, your throne shall be established forever. 1 Chronicles, I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne will be established forever. Later Jewish thought, the fact is that strictly speaking, the blessing who built this Jerusalem also does not require it. But since the kingdom of house of David is mentioned, it is not seemingly that the kingship of heaven also should not be mentioned. So this is a very complicated topic, but the kingdom of heaven is a very specific circumlocution used by Jesus and other Jewish sages. It is not at all related to the literal kingdom of David, which would be like Jerusalem. So the kingdom of heaven was a circumlocution for the kingdom of God, because if you're a pious Jew, you don't want to invoke God's name because God is holy, so you don't want to be profane. Don't profane his name. Don't be blasphemous. So they would use things like heaven to actually talk about God. And the kingdom of heaven is a separate term that had to do with God's redemptive activity in obedience to his will. This was used by Jewish sages to combat members of the fourth philosophy, and Jesus also is combating this movement. The fourth philosophy, Josephus tells us, so there's three philosophies that Josephus tells us. There's the Sadducees, there's the Pharisees, and then there's the Essenes, or the Qumran sectarian community. He goes on to share there's a fourth philosophy, and he calls them the fourth philosophy. They eventually become the Sicarii, but they were people who believed that God's reign is inaugurated by violence. By zeal. And zeal for the Lord is actually how we accomplish God's redemption. And they get this from Phineas when I believe there's like a story in the Old Testament where Moses is in his tent and somebody's like fornicating outside of the tent, and then somebody takes a spear and like kills them both, and then somebody says like, wow, you have zeal for the Lord. And so they would take these ideas and say, wow, we have to just kill them, the Romans, to basically get the kingdom back. That's what God wants us to do. And so the kingdom of heaven is more about hey, let's not do that. Let's actually do things where we love God through loving the orphans, the widows, etc. But that's not as important. I'm kind of talking about how the phrase was used. But I'm actually going to cite a source here that others can read. It's a public source from the Jerusalem Perspective, which is a scholarly group in Israel. So the kingdom, this is a quote from Joseph Frankovich, The Kingdom of Heaven. The kingdom of heaven resembles a concept in rabbinic Judaism called tikkun halom, which literally means mending the world. When one enters or joins the kingdom of heaven, one becomes a partner with God in spreading redemption throughout a hurting world. That person goes out and feeds the hungry, sounds like Jesus, clothes the naked, sounds like Jesus, visits those who are in the hospital and prisons, prays for the sick, and defends the rights of the orphan and the widow. A person who has entered the kingdom of heaven gets involved in people's lives. he or she who pursues a lifestyle characterized by mending our world. Where there is hatred, he or she sows love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light, etc. This reading is called The Kingdom of Heaven from Joseph Frankovich. He goes into Second Temple Jewish literature. I just didn't want to get into that on this presentation, but the link is right there. And essentially, this establishes why the kingdom of heaven, gotta go back here. Why the kingdom of heaven and the house of David do not overlap. So he's trying to say that there is a bunch of overlap between them. They're actually like interchangeable to some extent, but they're not. So the kingdom of heaven has to deal with how Jesus saw inaugurating his kingdom, where the house of David has to do more so with the literal office in Jerusalem. They're very different ideas. One is steeped in Jewish rabbinic and Jewish sage thought, and one is more so dealing with political stuff going on. I understand how like the key, there's a key, and they're both king. They're both, one's a house and one's a kingdom. But once you understand the context, similar to the binding and loosing, it gets very weird why Jesus would have used a common redemptive language to then talk about the house of David. It's like very convoluted for him to actually use something that he's consistent on in other areas, but then he's inconsistent here when he's talking about trying to allude to a verse.
Okay, but 2 Samuel 7:16 refers to a house, David's house, and a kingdom, as well as 1 Chronicles 17:14. So why would those two things refer to the same thing if they're not the same concept? Like, what? Like, are you saying that Jesus didn't have the same mind of 2 Samuel and the writer of 1 Chronicles?
No, what I'm saying is the kingdom of heaven isn't necessarily a literal kingdom like it is in those verses. Those verses are talking about literal, like we're gonna stay in power. We're gonna have a king on the throne in Jerusalem, and we're literally gonna conquer, and we're gonna be here forever. Those verses are not like spiritual. Those are very literal in the sense that, we're going to be here forever. We're going to have political freedom forever in this physical place. The kingdom of heaven was more of a circumlocution used to how are we going to bring redemption to the world. So there's a very two different phrases and two different ideas. They're like in different, they're in different boats. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, you see the Gospels. Jesus uses this phrase, "the kingdom of heaven," and that phrase, the way it's used, isn't anywhere close to how the house of David or kingdom of David or anything like that is used anywhere else.
Yeah, it's not. They're not the same idea. So to say they're the same thing, or Jesus would have used this to invoke it. If Jesus was doing this, he's trying to confuse everybody. He's trying to confuse me. He's trying to confuse Swan. He's trying to confuse his early audience. It just wouldn't make sense given the contemporary historical Jewish context of what the kingdom of heaven and Jesus' usage of it in the Gospels and in rabbinic literature. It just doesn't make sense.
Gotcha. Okay, let's keep going.
All right. So lastly, there's just too much of a difference between these ideas. As mentioned previously, if we have a simpler explanation that is more readily available, I misspelled readily, oh my goodness, readily available and contemporaneous, why would we not go with that explanation over something that is much more convoluted and hermeneutically entangled? So I just copied and pasted this. But again, the same criticism. So this is very complicated. There's got to be a bunch of massaging to get this syntactic correspondence to work. But given this contemporary evidence that Swan may not have even known about, it makes it very improbable that Jesus would have been invoking this verse. So I'm going to give him an X on this one. I don't think he gets this one. I think there's too many issues. I think that there's easier readings and given the historical context, it would be odd that Jesus would be trying to invoke different things, but then alluding to a verse somehow. It would have been very confusing to a first century Jew.
Just for a reminder, okay, so what phrases does Swan say that they parallel, and which ones do you say that don't parallel?
Yes, I actually skipped two. I skipped the key, and I'm going to wait for the, I believe he says the gates of, those are the two I focused on. Let me go back here. I just want to make sure I don't misspeak. right here. Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually the next one. Here we go. So no one shall versus in heaven, house of David versus kingdom of heaven, and open and shut versus bind and loose. And so I did the open and shut versus bind and loose. No one shall versus in heaven. No one and none shall shut versus. So I'll lay upon his shoulders what he shall open. No one shall shut. So he's trying to say, like the no one shall open or no one shall shut. If you open and shut, no one else will open and shut. And what Jesus is saying, if you bind and loose, it'll be bound in heaven. Many Jewish people felt that the Jewish high court acted on the authority of God's tribunal in heaven, in a sense ratifying its decrees. Binding and loosing could refer to detaining or releasing of prisoners, hence could function figuratively in a judicial setting. Rabbis also use these terms regularly for legislative authority, interpreting scripture, permitting, prohibiting, and permitting. Because binding and loosing were also figurative images for punishing and releasing, they could also be used judicially as well. That was kind of confusing to me, because that one doesn't really, even if you grant this one, it doesn't really make sense of the binding and loosing. I don't know why he's trying to posit this one, but I didn't really focus on it too much. I think that really where the importance lies is the binding and loosing. If that sort of is disconnected from Isaiah, then you just really don't have to worry about no one shall, versus in heaven. And what Swan is saying here is, well, this is a common way to talk about authority, but not the authority that's going on in Isaiah. It's a very specific authority to take his teachings to the movement. So it just wouldn't make sense why he would do that. Like, why would he allude to a verse here, and use language that would have been common for the time to talk about ritual purity laws? It just doesn't make. It starts to get a little convoluted given the context of being a Jew in the first century. The binding and the loosing and the open and shutting, and then no one shall shut, no one shall open, and then bound in heaven, loosed in heaven. Those are the things he's connecting. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I don't know if you
yeah,
have those pulled
yeah,
up
totally.
side by side. All right, so the next criteria here is recurrence. Recurrence has to deal with how often this author cites a verse in this book. So does Matthew cite Isaiah and other parts of his work, or is it cited maybe even in the period more? But specifically the book. So is he using Isaiah in other parts of the book? So I think what gets weird is this section of the method is a bit odd when applied to something like Isaiah. Isaiah was the most referenced book in terms of messianic expectations within Second Temple Judaism. So to use this to sort of increase the probability of allusion is somewhat misleading, because it's already the most cited book in antiquity, and it's one of the most cited books in all the Gospels. So it's kind of like, well, if you're going to posit an Isaiah allusion, you kind of get this one no matter what the verse is, right? Because it's like the most cited verse in the entire New Testament. And so then he goes, I'm just going to read his slide here. There are references in the immediate context or elsewhere by the same author to the same Old Testament context from which the purported allusion derives. So it also has to deal with is Matthew 15 and Matthew 17, could there also be more references to that section of the text as well? So are there allusions further along in the text or around it? So this is what he's saying. And there's an allusion to Isaiah 22:20, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, Matthew 17, Simon bar Jonah, which is son of in Aramaic, or Simon ben Jonah in Hebrew. Isaiah 22:23, firm peg / throne of glory. And in Matthew 16, this rock. And then this kind of rolls into his next section called thematic coherence, which is his last bullet here. But I'm going to take a second here. So the first one here is the son of. That is all over Jewish literature. So that's to me, I'm just going to wipe that off the table. That's irrelevant. But let's talk about the firm peg, right? And then this rock. Let's talk about that, because you know what? That does feel a little bit more specific, not as general of an people are. Everyone is announced as a son of somebody. in Jewish literature. So what's going on here with the rock? And the rock here, I think, actually has nothing to do with Isaiah, has everything to do with Abraham. And let's talk about what's going on here. So this is taken from Mark Turnage's book, Windows into the Bible. I highly recommend you read this. He has an entire chapter dedicated to "You Are Peter upon this rock" that talks about this. So this is actually Jewish literature that's close to the period. This would be a midrashim, so this would be, or like a midrash. This is like an interpretation of various verses. So what's going on here is like Jewish authors or Jewish thinkers would take all these different verses and then they would like find common language in them, and then they would tie them together. When I mean common language, like literally the exact Hebrew words, like verbatim Hebrew words, and would tie them together. But I'm going to read this this quote here. It could be compared to a king who desired to build a palace. He began digging, searching for solid rock, Petra, upon which he could lay foundations. But he found only mire, or like mud or sand. He dug in several other sites. Notice how similar this is to the parable of Jesus, the two foundations. He dug in several other sites, always with the same results. However, the king did not give up. He dug in another location. This time he struck solid rock, Petra, again. Here he said, I will build, and he laid foundations and built. In the same manner, the Holy One, blessed be he, before he created the world, sat and examined the generation of Enosh and the generation of the flood. He asked, how can I create the world when those wicked people will appear and provoke me to anger? It's kind of interesting, God's foreknowledge there. But when the Holy One, blessed be he saw Abraham, he said, here I have found a solid rock on which I can build upon, and I can lay the world's foundations. Very interesting. So Judaism repeatedly identified Abraham as the father of the faith. In this midrash, Abraham is the Petra on which God will build the world's foundations. And right before this, and this is in the book, but I didn't want it just be too many screenshots, the teller of this parable connects Isaiah 51, 1-2 to the foundation. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, which is tzedakah. What's interesting is in the Jewish literature, righteousness or tzedakah was connected to the kingdom of heaven. And we actually see this in Matthew, where Jesus says, if your righteousness does not exceed that of the chief priests and the scribes, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Righteousness in that verse, I think it's Matthew 5 or 6, that is literally like tzedakah in Hebrew. What Jesus is saying is if your giving doesn't exceed your almsgiving, or giving to the poor doesn't exceed the chief priests and the scribes, you're not gonna see the kingdom of heaven. Like you're not gonna be able to invoke it. You're not gonna be a part of our redemptive movement. That's interesting. That's actually connected to the keys, the kingdom of heaven. So this entire midrashim here, Abraham is seen as the righteous one, that the one who practiced righteousness. He's the Petra. And it's odd that we have contemporary Jews doing the exact same thing, calling someone a Petra, the same root word there. And what's interesting there is the wordplay that's in Greek doesn't work in Aramaic. It only works in Hebrew. So it's just interesting that we have a contemporary example of somebody saying that Abraham's the Petra. It's almost like Jesus is saying, Peter is the Petra of which I'm going to build the community of my faith. And then what's really interesting here is Abraham also ties into the gate of the enemies, which I did not. Oh, here we go. Jesus concluded his response to Peter, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. When God gave Isaac back to Abraham, he promised him, I'll surely bless you, and I will make your seed as numerous as the stars in the heaven and the sand on the seashore. And your seed will possess the gate of its enemies, and all the nations of the world will be blessed because you listen to my voice. Jesus' statement to Peter parallels the promise to Abraham. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Your seed will possess the gate of its enemies. It is not a coincidence that Jesus' response tied into the Abraham Petra Midrash and also alluded to God's promise to Abraham that his seed would possess the gate of its enemies. The faith of Abraham brought redemption because he listened to the voice of God. I think that this is interesting, and this kind of gives us another explanation as to why this is not about Eliakim, but Jesus is actually alluding to maybe something similar to Abraham. That similar thoughts were going about Abraham. He's the Petra of our faith. the foundation that God built our faith on. And Jesus is saying, no, Peter, you're going to be the next Petra. Any questions on that?
No, that was really, really cool. So just to be clear, so you have this rock that doesn't seem to make sense with Eliakim. You have rock in this Jewish literature that refers to Abraham. Now, a question for you: when is the dating of this literature?
But I think this is interesting here that we're finding other Jews connecting Petra and gates to Abraham. We have that going on with Jesus. And notice the similarities, right? So we're talking about a gate to a gate and a rock to a rock. And this is a peg to a rock. It's just like very different. The amount of those are not even similar. Like they don't belong in the same sentence if you're trying to say they're similar. And that's where I'm trying to posit alternative explanations that make more contemporary sense than an allusion to an Old Testament verse that has very clear issues with like the language. And that's something I didn't really go into here, but most of Jewish thinking is driven not by like philosophy or Western thought. It's driven by language. And so when you see something like this and the language is way off, especially for Jesus, that's a huge red flag that there's not an allusion going on here if someone's trying to posit that. Jesus actually is very specific with his language. I was actually going to show how Jesus would be alluding to Old Testament verses in very unclear ways, but how it's very specific. I didn't want to get into that because it would take up too much time, but you can compare that example to this example, and you can see how that one is a lot more straightforward than this one. And I think this allusion is not very straightforward. When you get into the context of what's going on here, there's no language parallels. You often have to boil down words to their like most base form. Like, oh, it's a command, and there's a command in Isaiah, and there's a command in Matthew. So that just doesn't work for me. And I don't think it should work for anyone else because it's not I don't think that's how you establish an illusion. All right. So I think that recurrence definitely fails here, given the fact that the son of Eliakim and the son of Jonah, Simon Bar Jonah, or Ben, that to me is like so high level. Like to say that that's like a multiple illusion. I don't know. That is like saying somebody is a son of it. That happens all over the Gospels. I don't think that it would establish an illusion at all. So, all right. So I don't repeat myself. Moving on to thematic coherence. So moving on to the fourth part is thematic coherence or patterns. Again, a lot of these start to feel like the same thing, like patterns. And I don't think the method is supposed to be doing that, but I think that Swan is kind of doing that a little bit with each of these, trying to find like patterns in the text. And again, that to me is a dangerous way to go about trying to find an illusion. But let's keep moving. Thematic coherence. So I think this is the most dangerous part of the method. If your hermeneutical lens is off, you can begin to create thematic occurrences based off of your understanding, but not off of the understanding the historical, geographical / spatial, cultural, and spiritual views of the authors. I think it's really easy to read in themes that don't actually exist. You can make them up. You can make the text read as if they have themes that are not really there. And yes, some of the Gospels have thematic chiasms going on, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, that can happen. I just think that one, it's kind of a caution, like be careful with this one because you could really just be doing a ton of eisegesis. This is essentially an interpretive lens on top of another interpretive lens. So it's like, hey, here's my interpretation, and then I'm going to interpret an additional theme on top of all of that. So let's take a look at what Swan's doing here. So premise one, thematic coherence, corruption to purity. What he's saying here, I think we already kind of went through this one. So Jesus is transferring teaching authority from the Pharisees and Sadducees to Peter, which again does not make any sense. This would not there was no teaching authority there that was monolithic or substantial. Everyone, the debate was everywhere. People were debating constantly. This would have been like, this wouldn't have made sense. So I think that it is possible to sort of create the fallacy of like begging the question here, where you're kind of already assuming the conclusion and then like reading that theme into the text. Not saying that Swan is doing this, but then just another warning. So Timothy, Rucker, and Swan suggest three different themes that correlate from Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22. The first one is corruption to purity. I kind of went over this one. Rucker suggests that Jesus is transferring the authority from the Pharisees to Sadducees to Peter. That just isn't happening. There's no monolithic teaching authority. Everyone debated. Everyone had their view. All these Jewish sages, we have them recorded in a vote of the fathers. They debated. I just don't think that this makes any sense. I mean, you could ask any ancient Jewish scholar if they read this, they'd be like, nope, that doesn't, I don't even know what this is about. So this wouldn't have happened because it wouldn't have made sense to do. There would have been no reason to take authority that wasn't even monolithic anyways to give it to Peter. And I know that like as Christians, we kind of like think of the papacy and we can like, that just didn't exist in ancient Judaism. Like Caiaphas had no authority to teach. He wasn't like a pope. That didn't exist in this period.
Okay, but I mean, we kind of mentioned this, but I mean, at the same time, though, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were seen as like teaching leaders. I mean, are you literally saying that they had no authority? Like the people didn't see them
No, I
as
mean,
authority?
no, but yeah, they were seen as teaching leaders, but there was like synagogue leaders all over Galilee. There's Pharisees all over Galilee in the Judean hill country and in Jerusalem. The Sadducees were more located in Jerusalem because they were like a priestly aristocracy. They were more like heavily located there. They weren't located among the people outside of the city as much. But there just isn't like a monolithic teaching authority to take from them, right? It's like saying my high school teacher needs someone to take their authority and give it to like a different person. It's like my high school teacher had authority because of her position, but like there's no authority for Jesus to take really. Like this wouldn't the Pharisees were located all over Galilee, over dozens and dozens of miles. Um, this what Jesus is doing here is saying you have my authority to take my teachings and apply it to the movement. He's not taking the authority and stealing it or transferring it. And then also given the next slide here, uh, why would Jesus then endorse them in Matthew 24? Listen to their teachings on the seat of Moses. So yeah, it's just very odd. Which I think that this demonstrates that this view and this interpretation isn't tenable. This doesn't even make sense. So why would he be transferring the authority when he later says to actually listen to their teachings? Well, they must still have authority then. So I think that view just isn't tenable, given the text itself. But then even like the historical context, it's like this isn't how. There was no like monolithic, like Jesus wasn't like stealing all the teaching authority and then giving it to Peter. He was just establishing Peter to take his teachings and make halakhic authority in different rulings on his teachings for the movement. And then the next theme is shame and glory. The correlation of Shebna is very weak here. I think it's a big stretch. And Swan even says that some people say, well, are you trying to say there's a Shebna typology now? And so this theme here is actually not about Peter and Eliakim, but it's Peter and Shebna. And Swan even recognizes that. So it's just really odd. Notice how convoluted this is getting. So going back to my previous issues with this part of the method creates large margin for error to impose your own patterns, even when the patterns don't work well. And the shame and glory has to deal with Peter, getting you're going to pound this rock, I'm going to build my church. And then right after that, he says, get behind me, Satan. Similarly, Shebna has, some glory given, and then they're like sort of reprimanded because they're unfaithful. That's the sort of thematic coherence that's going on between the texts. But what's odd is this is not about Eliakim anymore. It's about Shebna. This is getting very complicated. So like we're getting really Jesus is really invested in this illusion now. Again, just not very likely. The last one is the rise and fall. So Eliakim had a prophecy in 22, 24 to 25 that his house would fall. And then Swan is trying to say that, Peter had to rise and then he's going to fall because he's going to deny Jesus 3 times. And so there's a theme there as well. I think this is by far one of the weakest and most dangerous part of the method. Notice how generalized this is. It's almost like you could find thematic coherence anywhere. And I think without a better linguistic connection to Isaiah 20:22, this is a very weak point. I think without more verbatim connection per Hayes's method, this is a very weak point. And I even say here, there appears to be thematic coherence here, but that doesn't justify an illusion. There could be thematic coherence between Abraham Lincoln and Jesus. And that doesn't mean that they knew each other or that Jesus would have alluded to him or, there could be thematic coherence between so many things that are just not at all connected. So that's what gets confusing here. And when we don't have that, strict linguistic connection, it gets weak. All right. So again, I think that this one fails, even if granted, this is by far the weakest point of the method, because I think there's way too much ideas you could be imposing, lots of generalizations going on. And then also given the fact that there isn't verbatim and even the syntax, the hypothetical correspondence between the verses in volume or part 2 of this is quite weak. So, it's close to granting this one. I'm kind of being cheeky here, but the streak looked too good, 3 X's in a row. But even if this was granted, it doesn't do much. I mean, it doesn't do much at all. If you had all of these and you removed thematic coherence or added it, I wouldn't even care. It just is a very weak point, but still don't think it works. Fifth here is historical plausibility, and this is actually my favorite one, and I've already been kind of hinting to it in this discussion. And I think that this actually introduces an internal critique with these criteria, given the information I've already presented. So what historical plausibility is, what Swan is saying here, using Hayes's method, is that would a first century reader have understood this? If there's an allusion here, would it have made sense to them, and would they have thought of the allusion themselves? The value of the test is to make us wary of readings that turn Paul into a Lutheran or a deconstructionist. One implication of this criterion is to give serious preference to interpretive proposals that allow Paul to remain a Jew. That sounds like a lot of what I've been saying today, doesn't it? And that's exactly what Hayes says about his own criteria. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, would a first century Jewish reader or the first century recipient of this gospel have understood this as an allusion? The answer is no. If I'm a first century Jew and I hear contemporary language about the kingdom of heaven, binding and loosing, they are going to immediately think of contemporary usage of the circumlocution and halakhic terminology. This is not at all in any way ever going to make a first century Jew think you're trying to allude to Isaiah 22:22. So either Jesus was trying to confuse his audience or speak to Catholics. So I think that this one here is quite damning. It just isn't historically plausible. Again, given the context, Jesus alluding to an Old Testament verse, but using all of these very specific ideas that are completely unconnected from the verse to allude to the verse. It's just implausible. So this one fails with the same force as number 2. Actually, hold on. I'm reading the next slide. So Swan mentions that Hayes advises that this does not become anachronistic. So that means reading your own theology or reading your own meaning into the text. If you have been following along, I feel like this has become to feel very anachronistic. and not preserving Jesus and his own unique genius. This does feel like trying to make Jesus say what a Catholic would say. It just is. We are not utilizing contemporary Jewish techniques, interpretive techniques, given Swan's reasons, that would not have belonged to the traditions that Jesus aligned himself with. Meaning, Jesus would not have done this given how he thinks in the Gospels and how he talks in the Gospels. He would not have alluded to a verse in this extremely convoluted way. So this one fails with the same force as volume does, as number two allows us to demonstrate a historically contemporary interpretive technique that would be available to us instead of something that isn't. There is not a clear reason Jesus would not have invoked this verse in this. There is not a clear reason that Jesus would have invoked this verse in this manner, as there are too many contemporary reasons to think otherwise. It just doesn't, again, I'm repeating myself here, but it just doesn't really make sense why Jesus would have used all of these different things to then allude to a verse that would, if anything, would have actually trailed their original hearer away from that verse. Any questions on that one?
Oh yeah, and that's a really good point at the end there. Just to bring that out, you're saying that not only would it not make sense to them, but it would actually confuse them. It would distract them from what Sona is actually thinking that Jesus is trying to say.
Yes, exactly. All right, so the number 6 here, history of interpretation. So this is recognized as not being the most reliable for determining allusion. This is Swan's own words. I agree with this. For example, in the last 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. This completely transformed New Testament studies and kind of gave a giant reset button in the last half a decade on New Testament interpretation. So I think discoveries like this can kind of make history of interpretation quite unreliable. Just because people interpreted this in church history doesn't mean it's true. Swan knows the scholar, but the preeminent scholar David Flusser has pioneered studies on ancient Judaism and its intersection within the origins of Christianity. These realities give us good reasons to be very careful of history of interpretation within Jewish thought, Jesus including. So I'm going to read this quote here from his argument. It's important to survey the history of the interpretation of the New Testament passage in order to see if others have observed this allusion. Yet this is one of the least reliable criteria in recognizing allusions. Though a study of past interpretation may reveal the possible allusions proposed by others, it can also lead to a narrowing of the possibilities, since commentators can tend to follow earlier commentators, and since commentary tradition always has the possibility of distorting or misinterpreting and losing the fresh and creative approach of the New Testament writers' intertextual collocations. That was a mouthful. So what Swan tries to say is we have one early church father from the 4th century, Theodoret of Cyrus. I personally have issues with the church fathers for most things. I think once you begin to study Christian origins, you'll begin to see this is, again, pretty dominant view in New Testament scholarship that by about 100 AD, the Gentiles took over the early church. Many scholars recognize this, and many ponder and hypothesize how this happened. But this caused the Gentile movement of the church to be massively miss the nuance and context of Jesus' world. And honestly, I think one of why I'm here today and discussing this is a ramification of this very reality. The early church very quickly divorced itself from the original context of Jesus. That's where we have like Augustine of Hippo, interpreting the parables of Jesus allegorically in saying that that Rome is like the lost coin, or different things like this. I'm not even kidding. Like reading his stuff is almost like a comedy. It's so bad. And this did happen, but they were completely unaware of the early context of Jesus. And we've actually uncovered that more than ever in all of history. The last 70 years, we've understood more about the world of Jesus than Christians had for the last 1,500 years. We're extremely privileged. So regardless of all of this, actually it's a 5th century allusion. That's a typo at the top. Personally, if 1,000 church fathers said this in the 5th century, I still think my rebuttals would still count. I wouldn't care. I think this issue is the issue of a better, less complicated, more accessible interpretation is available. Why should we posit this? that a 5th century church father said there's an allusion here and, says very similar things about the allusion. To me, that doesn't add a lot of evidence to this. That's hundreds of years after. It's a Gentile church father that it kind of already established the Pope. The papacy was already there. There's an incentive there to read into the text. I just don't think it really does much. But given that, for the sake and time of brevity, he did have a 5th century citation. So I'll grant him that, 5th century church father had it. But to me, very, very little weight here. The church fathers do not hold more weight than contemporary Jewish allusions, Jewish authors, etc. So it doesn't really do much, honestly, for the argument. And then satisfaction has to deal with how satisfying is it, like the explanation. I don't know. Hey, I guess it satisfies your view of the papacy. So sure, you can get that. But so does my view. So I don't think it really does much either. So some of these are just weird. Does it make sense of the verses and things like that? Does it make sense of what Jesus is doing there? I guess you can kind of finagle the text. And again, I have a different view than Swan, but mine also satisfies the text, which kind of shows you this criteria is a bit weak. But if I grant it, so he's got availability, he's got history of interpretation, which is going to be typically Catholic in nature anyways, and then satisfaction. So he doesn't get volume, so the verbatim isn't there. The correspondence I've demonstrated is mistaken. The recurrence isn't there because it's about Abraham, not about a peg. There isn't thematic coherence here. And he even kind of talks about how Peter and Shebna is an Eliakim. I think there's some issues there. You can read themes in anywhere. Historical plausibility, absolutely implausible. A Jew wouldn't have done this. Jesus wouldn't have done this given the other parts of the Gospels. So he gets those 3 and misses those 4. We'll match those up with his 7 that he granted himself. I think this is his full slide. He says, premise 1, there is a textual allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19. And, I'm just going to say there is no textual allusion to Matthew 20:22 and Matthew 16. I think what I've done today demonstrates that Swan's suggested allusion does not work given Hayes' own criteria. He said in his video, How to Defeat This Argument, one of the ways to do it is that it does not meet Richard Hayes' standards or disagree with them. I don't think he's missing 4, I think the most important part of the 7. And even if someone might disagree with some of the things I said today, I think I've definitely even submitted some undercutting defeaters here that demonstrate that this allusion is pretty weak and you can't really build a dogma off of it. Even if you were able to soften some of these points, I think what I've done today demonstrates that building doctrine off of this proof text would be very, very dangerous given the issues surrounding a lot of Swan's points. The last thing I'll say is, why does this matter? So we're sitting here, we're discussing the papacy, discussing the words of Jesus. And I think, what's important is understanding that we're talking about Jesus. And personally, I think that our world has a lot of tension right now. And I think that the words of Jesus matter. And I think that our society can be, if we can be re-enchanted with the words and message of Jesus, it has the power to transform our world. It's already done it. Eusebius records that that Christians were the only ones who were helping in a pandemic, actually. And the Gentiles and the Jews had left the city. And we find that only the Christians stayed because they were obeying the words of Jesus. And I think, this discussion does matter on a different level that Swan and I would agree on, that, the message and words of Jesus have the power to transform our society. Martin Luther King did it. He utilized the teachings of Jesus in nonviolent protests and changed our world, changed the United States, and that spread. And I think we've seen it in our era, we've seen it in ancient times, and I think that this discussion is just so vitally important. And discussion around, the words of Jesus are so important, and really trying to uncover who was Jesus, what did he say, who was he as a man of his time, and just making sure that we're not making the Jesus of faith the Jesus of history, and that we allow the Jesus of history to transform us. And I think, I'm guilty of this as well, of like reading my own things into the text or making Jesus sound and look like me. But ultimately, I want to be proven wrong. I want to understand who Jesus was in history. Who really was he? And that's the person who's going to transform my life and transform our society and transform our culture and communities. So I think that this discussion is vitally important.
Awesome. I really appreciate you saying all that. Okay, so 2 really quick questions. Okay, one, what is your interpretation of this Matthew 16 passage if you don't take his view?
Yeah, great question. So my interpretation would be that Jesus is kind of combining multiple elements. The kingdom of heaven is his view of redemption happening for the Jewish people and then eventually for Gentiles. So he's handing him the keys of redemption to kind of take his movement and spread it, and giving him authority to create rules, much like we see in Acts 15 for the Gentiles, even for Jews who might have had different standards than Gentiles at the time, and saying that the gates of Hades won't overcome it, and you're going to be the rock I build it on. You're going to be, that. And I don't think it's necessarily Peter as a specific person. I think that did spread out to the apostles, as we saw in Acts 15. James is the one who actually ended up handing out the decree, not Peter. But I think he's handing the movement over to his apostles because he knows that he's going to be killed. And if Jesus doesn't do that, his movement's over. We're not here today. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. And so I think what he's doing is he's establishing the leaders to carry his message and his movement on, and giving them authority to kind of take it and apply it.
Gotcha.
Much
okay.
like any Jewish sage would have done at the time. This would have been a common thing to do. It wouldn't have been like abnormal. Of course, Jesus has his own unique genius in here, right? The kingdom of heaven and things like that. He is a unique person. But again, this wouldn't have been something that would have been abnormal to do, to hand over halakhic authority.
Okay. And last question. Okay. Anyways, yep. So that's all I got for you. This has been a really great time talking. I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this and really enjoy this. And so I know you don't have a YouTube. You don't have a blog. You're just doing this out of the goodness of your heart, right? You don't have any place we can reach you at.
You can get me on the Capturing Christianity private group, Ryan Warner, but I've thought about starting a YouTube channel to discuss things like this in archaeological digs. So if there's enough traction on your channel saying, hey, I want to hear more about this kind of stuff and maybe hear from more scholars, I would probably start something like that to make it more accessible to people.
Oh, that's cool, man. Yeah. Oh, we'll definitely have to have you back on about that. So that's super cool. I didn't know about you before this. Okay, so yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your night. This has been fun, and yeah, we'll talk later.
See ya. Bye.